Hey guys, tonight we're doing something very calm, very bureaucratic, very paperwork heavy. So go ahead and dim the lights, put your phone face down, loosen your shoulders, and let the gentle hum of international diplomacy lull you into a peaceful, semi-conscious state. Because tonight, we begin with how the United Nations was formed. Which sounds exciting, but trust me, it's mostly tired men in suits, exhausted by war, arguing politely about borders, committees, and whether France still counts as a major power. Spoiler alert, they decided yes, because feelings. Now, before the UN existed, the world had already tried this whole let's all agree not to kill each other thing once before. That was called the League of Nations, and it failed, spectacularly, like a beautifully written rule book that no one bothered to read. The League of Nations was born after World War I, full of hope, optimism, and exactly zero enforcement power. It was like telling a group of armed neighbors, please don't fight, and if you do, we'll be very disappointed. Germany ignored it. Japan ignored it, Italy laughed at it, and the United States, in a particularly on-brand move, never even joined, because why commit when you can just watch from across the ocean? By the late 1930s, the League of Nations was basically an abandoned group chat, messages unread, warnings ignored, everyone muted. And then World War II happened, which, as wars go, was not subtle, not short, and not good for anyone's sleep schedule. By the early 1940s, tens of millions were dead, cities were flattened, empires were crumbling, and everyone involved was deeply, profoundly tired. Which is usually when humans decide to invent a new organization. The idea behind the United Nations didn't appear suddenly at the end of the war. It crept in slowly during the conflict itself, when leaders realized that if they survived this mess, they really didn't want to do it again. Enter Franklin D. Roosevelt, President of the United States, man of many speeches, and owner of a voice that sounds like it was designed specifically for fireside chats and calm reassurance. Roosevelt was very into the idea of collective security. He believed that after the war, the world would need a permanent structure to manage disputes, prevent conflicts, and gently scold countries before they started bombing each other. He didn't want another League of Nations situation. This time, the big powers would actually be involved, especially the United States, because apparently ignoring global politics didn't work out so well. In 1941, Roosevelt met with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. This meeting took place aboard ships in the Atlantic Ocean because apparently that's how you do dramatic diplomacy. Together, they produced the Atlantic Charter, which sounds like a pirate document, but was actually a short list of shared principles. No territorial expansion, self-determination for peoples, free trade, peace after the war. It was vague, idealistic, and extremely optimistic given that most of the world was still on fire. Still, it planted a seed. Then, on January 1st, 1942, representatives from 26 countries signed something called the Declaration by United Nations. Yes, that's the first time the phrase United Nations was used officially. At this stage, United Nations didn't mean a global organization, it meant the Allies, basically a club of countries agreeing to fight the Axis powers together and not make separate peace deals. The list included the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, China, and a collection of governments in exile who were very optimistic about returning home someday. Everyone promised to pool resources, everyone promised to keep fighting, everyone promised not to betray each other, which is always nice to say out loud. As the war dragged on, discussions about the post-war world became more serious because once you defeat fascism, you still have to figure out what comes next, and history has shown that we'll figure it out later is not a solid plan. In 1943, representatives from the US, the UK, the Soviet Union, and China met in Moscow. They issued the Moscow Declaration, which officially stated that there would be a new international organization after the war to maintain peace and security. This was a big deal. It meant that even Stalin was on board, and Stalin did not agree to things casually. Of course, everyone had very different ideas about what this organization should actually do. The Americans wanted a system where countries talked things out. The British wanted to preserve their influence and empire quietly and politely. The Soviets wanted security above all else, preferably with buffers, veto power, and absolutely no surprises. China wanted recognition as a major power, which after years of invasion and civil war felt long overdue. So, naturally, they compromised, which means everyone got something and no one was fully satisfied. In 1944, the real blueprint for the United Nations took shape at the Dunbarton Oaks Conference in Washington, D.C. Yes, Dunbarton Oaks, a very sleepy-sounding name, extremely appropriate. Over several weeks, diplomats hammered out the structure of the future organization. There would be a General Assembly where every member state could talk, debate, and pass resolutions that were mostly non-binding, and then there would be a Security Council, the real power center. 5 permanent members, 1 veto each: the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, China, and France. Each with veto power, because nothing says collective decision-making like letting 5 countries say no to everything. The veto was controversial even then. Smaller nations worried it gave too much power to the big players, which, to be fair, it absolutely did. But the logic was simple. If the major powers weren't given special privileges, they wouldn't join, and if they didn't join, the organization would collapse immediately. Everyone remembered the League of Nations. No one wanted that again. So, the veto stayed. Now, you might notice one thing missing from Dunbarton Oaks: human rights. They were barely mentioned, because at this point, the focus was preventing war, not fixing humanity. That would come later, after everyone had a nap. Also missing was agreement on how trusteeships and colonies would be handled, because empire was still very much a thing, and letting go of colonies was uncomfortable. In 1945, as the war in Europe came to an end, representatives from 50 countries gathered in San Francisco for the United Nations Conference on International Organization. This was the big one, the final draft, the official birth of the United Nations. The city was buzzing, hotels were packed, translators worked non-stop. Everyone was exhausted but hopeful. Roosevelt, who had championed the UN idea from the beginning, never got to see it completed. He died in April 1945, just weeks before the conference, which feels tragically on brand for history. Harry Truman, now president, carried the torch. He supported the UN strongly, partly because Roosevelt had, and partly because the alternative was another war. At the conference, smaller nations pushed for stronger roles, more safeguards, more voice. The big powers listened, nodded, adjusted some language, and then kept the veto. On June 26, 1945, the United Nations Charter was signed. It laid out the purposes of the organization: maintaining international peace and security, developing friendly relations among nations, promoting social progress, encouraging human rights. Big goals, soft wording, room for interpretation. The Charter officially came into force on October 24, 1945. That date is now celebrated as United Nations Day. And just like that, the UN existed. Not as a world government, not as a global police force, but a permanent meeting place for humanity's disagreements. A forum for arguments, resolutions, strongly worded statements, and the occasional peacekeeping mission. It was born from exhaustion, trauma, and a shared realization that maybe, just maybe, talking was better than bombing. Of course, it wasn't perfect. It never would be. But for a world still smelling faintly of smoke, it was something. Let's slowly drift forward into the early days of the UN itself, where hope fades a little, cynicism grows, and the paperwork somehow multiplies. All right, welcome back. Get comfortable again. Maybe adjust the pillow, because we're gently drifting into the early years of the United Nations. The war